June 6, 1944. As the first rays of dawn pierced the Normandy sky, a Waco CG-4A glider, having severed its umbilical tow line at an altitude of 800 feet, commenced its perilous descent. Within its unpowered fuselage, firmly secured to the floor, lay a Willis M.B. Jeep, a compact yet robust assemblage of 2,450 pounds of steel, resilient rubber, and finely tuned engine mechanics. The glider pilot, grappling with the control yoke, fought against the relentless pull of gravity as dense hedgerows and unforgiving terrain rapidly materialized below. Then came the inevitable, violent impact. The airframe's metallic skin crumpled, accordion-like, its fabric rending with a shriek, and wooden spars violently disintegrated into a storm of splinters. As the chaotic dust settled, an utterly improbable sound emerged. The Jeep's engine sputtered to life. Miraculously, the vehicle extricated itself from the shattered remains of its transport, its suspension systems fully operational, its steering precisely responsive, poised to ferry Allied troops deeper inland, while the German defenders were still reeling from the shock of the invasion. This extraordinary outcome was no mere stroke of fortune. It was the culmination of an engineering feat that, a mere 18 months prior, the United States Army Air Forces had emphatically dismissed as an egregious squandering of vital wartime resources. Across the tumultuous expanse of the English Channel on that pivotal morning, more than 1,400 of these resilient Jeeps underwent similarly brutal arrivals into the heart of occupied France. Gliders, designed for a single, one-way mission, plunged headlong into solid stone walls, executed jarring belly flops into waterlogged fields, and somersaulted uncontrollably across verdant pastures. The aircraft themselves were, by design, entirely disposable. Yet, the Jeeps, they were unequivocally indispensable. They were mandated to not only endure these devastating crashes but to drive away fully operational from the very wreckage that had claimed the lives of their airborne carriers. Conventional military doctrine unequivocally declared such a feat to be utterly unachievable. The prevailing wisdom dictated that one simply could not sufficiently package a ground vehicle to withstand the destructive forces capable of tearing apart an aircraft. The intricate calculations proved intractable, and the necessary specialized materials were deemed unobtainable amidst the exigencies of global conflict. And yet, defying all established logic, there they were, these robust vehicles, navigating the narrow pathways of Norman villages, their delivery craft smoldering in chaotic heaps behind them. The individual credited with this remarkable innovation was neither a high-ranking general nor a seasoned military engineer possessing decades of ordnance expertise. Instead, he was a civilian, previously shown the door by the Army in 1942, a consultant unequivocally dismissed as an eccentric crackpot utterly out of touch with practical, real-world constraints. His name was Palmer Koslick Putnam, and his unwavering dedication to resolving a problem that no one else believed soluble ultimately revolutionized the very nature of airborne warfare. However, what truly distinguishes this narrative from the myriad other accounts of wartime technological breakthroughs is the profound resistance Putnam's design initially encountered. His proposed solution was so daringly unconventional, so fundamentally antithetical to entrenched military doctrine, that even after its efficacy was undeniably proven in rigorous testing, the Quartermaster Corps made concerted efforts to suppress its adoption. Their objections were multifaceted and, from their perspective, entirely valid, encompassing genuine concerns regarding the exorbitant material costs during a period of severe wartime rationing, the potential for crippling production bottlenecks, and the complexities of field maintenance in combat zones. Beneath these practical concerns, however, simmered a powerful undercurrent of institutional pride, The deeply unpalatable prospect of acknowledging that an external civilian had successfully tackled a challenge that their own highly esteemed engineers had failed to overcome. Such an admission proved a particularly bitter pill to swallow. This is fundamentally a story of how an urgent, overriding necessity ultimately triumphed over ingrained institutional ego. It chronicles how one man's seemingly extravagant and wasteful design became the decisive factor, determining the critical distinction between dynamic Allied mobility and crippling Allied stagnation in the crucial hours following the D-Day landings. It delves into the often overlooked realm of hidden logistics, the unglamorous yet utterly vital engineering endeavors that rarely feature in dramatic combat footage, but which inexorably dictate whether armies can successfully advance or become hopelessly bogged down. And its origins lie in comprehending precisely why, in the year 1942, virtually every expert within the U.S. military establishment firmly believed that the successful airdropping of functional jeeps was nothing more than a fantastical pipe dream. Palmer Coslet Putnam, by all outward appearances, seemed an unlikely candidate to spearhead a revolution in military logistics. Born in 1900 into a distinguished publishing family in New York, his professional journey through the 1930s had seen him pursuing ambitious wind energy ventures in Vermont, painstakingly designing experimental turbines that utility companies, with polite but firm indifference, largely disregarded. Armed with an engineering degree from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, he possessed an exceptionally restless intellect and had cultivated a reputation for consistently approaching complex problems from refreshingly unconventional perspectives. As the ominous clouds of war gathered over Europe, Putnam recognized a profound opportunity to contribute his unique talents. In early 1941, he formally approached the War Department, submitting detailed proposals for innovative airborne supply systems. The Army, at that time overwhelmed by a deluge of defense contractors and self-proclaimed visionaries, unceremoniously relegated his correspondence to the expansive archives reserved for unsolicited civilian suggestions. Then came the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, a cataclysmic event that dramatically altered the military's previously dismissive stance towards external ideas. The Army Air Forces, in the immediate aftermath, committed to an unprecedented and massive expansion of its airborne divisions, specialized paratrooper units tasked with seizing critical bridges and strategic crossroads far in advance of conventional ground forces. However, a glaring and critical flaw permeated this ambitious doctrine. Paratroopers, by their very nature, constituted light infantry. They descended with essential personal weaponry, rifles, light machine guns, perhaps a few portable mortars, but critically, no vehicles, no heavy artillery, and no capacity for sustained, heavy firepower. Once they landed, they were effectively isolated and stranded until their ground-based counterparts could successfully link up. The formidable German Wehrmacht had learned this brutal lesson at immense cost during the invasion of Crete in May 1941, where their own paratroopers suffered devastating casualties before vital reinforcements could arrive. American military planners, acutely aware of this precedent, were absolutely determined not to replicate such a catastrophic mistake. The seemingly straightforward solution that emerged was the deployment of gliders. These engineless aircraft possessed the distinct advantage of being towed behind larger transport planes, then released silently over designated landing zones, offering the capability to deliver significantly heavier equipment than could be parachuted. The British, ever innovative, were already actively experimenting with their Horsa glider, a craft capable of transporting a jeep or a light artillery piece. Capitalizing on this concept, the Americans developed their own variant, the Waco CG-4A, designed with the impressive capacity to haul up to 3,750 pounds of cargo. Problem solved, it appeared. Or so it seemed. The reality, however, was far more complex. Engineers swiftly uncovered a fundamental and catastrophic incompatibility between gliders and jeeps. A fully equipped jeep, complete with fuel and necessary gear, weighed a substantial 2,450 pounds. During the inherently violent process of a glider landing, which was, in essence, a meticulously controlled crash, this heavy vehicle transformed into an unrestrained battering ram. If secured using conventional methods, the immense impact forces would either violently rip the jeep from its moorings, sending it careening destructively through the glider's fragile fuselage, or the sheer deceleration shock would warp its robust frame, shatter its axles, and reduce its engine block to an irreparable mass of scrap metal. Recognizing the gravity of this challenge, the Quartermaster Corps, in mid-1942, assigned their most capable engineers to tackle this seemingly intractable problem. Their initial attempts involved the application of reinforced tie-downs, yet the jeep consistently sustained critical damage. Subsequently, they experimented with padding the landing gear contact points, but the vehicle's frame stubbornly continued to twist and distort. Even efforts to reduce the fuel load in an attempt to lessen overall weight proved futile. The jeep invariably arrived in a state of irreparable disrepair. After a frustrating 6 months of successive failures, the official recommendation was to completely abandon the concept of jeep delivery by glider, advocating instead for a focus on smaller, less critical cargo that could more readily withstand the rigors of rough landings. However, airborne commanders, acutely aware of their troops' desperate need for mobility and firepower, vehemently opposed this suggestion. Without mobile transport and the ability to deploy sustained firepower, their paratroopers, they argued, would face certain annihilation. The situation had devolved into an intractable stalemate. This was precisely the dire predicament when Palmer Putnam arrived at Wright Field, Ohio, in December 1942. He had learned through unofficial channels of the military's persistent vehicle delivery dilemma, and was convinced he possessed a viable solution. The engineering officers who met with him were, predictably, skeptical from the outset. Putnam was not merely proposing improved tie-downs or more robust glider frames. His radical concept involved constructing a substantial wooden crate around each jeep, a specialized container meticulously designed to absorb and dissipate impact forces through its own controlled, sacrificial destruction. The quartermaster officers, with their acute understanding of logistics and resource allocation, immediately grasped the implications. Putnam's design would necessitate an estimated 200 board feet of plywood per jeep, in addition to significant quantities of steel cable and specialized assembly procedures. When extrapolated across the thousands of jeeps required for the war effort, this translated into an astronomical consumption of materials, resources that could otherwise be allocated to constructing vital barracks, essential landing craft, or critical aircraft components. In the midst of the most severe material shortages in American history, Putnam was advocating for a protective crate that, in terms of material cost, was nearly as expensive as the indispensable vehicle it encased. They politely thanked him for his time and summarily dismissed him. Officially, Palmer Putnam's audacious proposal was rejected on January 8, 1943. The Army maintained that it would undoubtedly discover an alternative solution. Yet, in truth, no such alternative existed, a reality tacitly understood by all involved. To fully comprehend why Putnam's idea initially appeared so utterly preposterous requires a fundamental understanding of the brutal physics governing glider crashes. A fully laden Waco CG-4A glider typically approached its designated landing zone at an approximate speed of 70 miles per hour, descending at a steep, unyielding angle due to the absence of an engine to modulate its descent. While pilots ideally aimed for expansive, open fields, the harsh realities of combat conditions, characterized by dense hedgerows, cratered terrain, and relentless enemy fire, often compelled them to accept whatever landing site presented itself. The instant the glider's skids made contact with the earth, the deceleration was anything but gradual. It was unequivocally violent. In a mere fraction of a second, the vehicle transitioned from highway-level velocity to a complete standstill. The forces unleashed during such an event were not the gentle G-forces experienced during a controlled car braking. Rather, they were catastrophic collision forces, capable of crumpling even the strongest steel. For the Jeep secured within, this violent deceleration created a cascade of multiple, interconnected failure points. Firstly, there was the inexorable force of inertia. Newton's first law of motion, indifferent to military necessity or strategic imperatives, dictated that the 2,450-pound vehicle, traveling at 70 miles per hour, desired to maintain that forward momentum even after its glider carrier had abruptly ceased movement. Standard cargo straps, even those robust, military-grade variants specifically rated for aircraft use, were simply incapable of withstanding this immense, instantaneous load. They either snapped under the strain or violently ripped their anchor points clean out of the glider's wooden floor. Engineers calculated that restraining a Jeep to keep it stationary during such an impact demanded tie-downs capable of enduring over 15,000 pounds of instantaneous force. Constructing restraints of such prodigious strength would necessitate reinforcing the entire glider cargo bay, an undertaking that would add prohibitive weight, consequently reducing the crucial payload capacity, thereby entirely defeating the glider's intended purpose. The second critical problem was that even if, by some miracle, the Jeep could be prevented from moving within the fuselage, the sheer deceleration forces would still utterly destroy the vehicle itself. One might vividly imagine bolting a Jeep immovably to a concrete wall, and then propelling that wall into the Jeep at 70 miles per hour. This chilling scenario functionally replicated what occurred during a hard glider landing. The Jeep's frame would flex far beyond its engineered tolerance limits. Suspension components, meticulously designed to absorb the shocks of bumps and jumps during normal operation, not to withstand instantaneous, catastrophic stops, would shear violently from their mounting points. The engine, typically resting on rubber mounts to dampen vibrations during regular use, would transform into a 400-pound kinetic wrecking ball, tearing loose from its moorings and obliterating everything in its immediate vicinity. Transmissions would crack under the strain, axles would bend irrevocably, and wheels would catastrophically break off their hubs. The third pervasive issue revolved around the inherent unpredictability of the landing itself. A theoretically perfect glider approach onto a perfectly flat expanse of ground might generate forces within survivable limits for the cargo, but combat landings were, by their very nature, far from perfect. Gliders frequently struck hidden ditches and nosed over, slamming their cargo violently forward into the cockpit bulkhead. They often caught treacherous crosswinds, causing them to roll sideways, tumbling their precious cargo like garments in a dryer. They collided with unforeseen obstacles, towering trees, sturdy fence posts, abandoned farm equipment, and disintegrated asymmetrically, exacerbating the destructive forces on the cargo. During extensive training exercises conducted in North Carolina throughout 1942, the 82nd Airborne Division recorded an abysmal Jeep survival rate of less than 30%. A staggering 70% of the vehicles delivered by glider were either too severely damaged to drive or required hours of intricate field repairs, a luxury that the brutal, fast-paced conditions of actual combat would simply not afford. However, the inherent limitations of combat conditions frequently rendered such efforts futile. The prevailing engineering wisdom firmly asserted the impossibility of devising a restraint system robust enough to withstand every conceivable crash scenario. The sheer multiplicity of variables and the extreme magnitudes of destructive forces simply defied comprehensive mitigation. Consequently, the military urgently required a method to render the Jeep itself impervious to the violent energies unleashed during a crash, an ingenious way to somehow isolate the vehicle from the surrounding maelstrom. The question, however, remained profoundly perplexing. One could not simply encase a Jeep in protective bubble wrap, nor could enough cushioning be applied without augmenting the overall dimensions to an impractical degree for glider transport. Furthermore, a fundamental redesign of the Jeep was out of the question. Willis Overland was already operating at peak production capacity, and any alterations to the design would inevitably bring manufacturing to a grinding halt for an extended period. Several astute engineers put forth an alternative proposition: the construction of specialized airborne Jeeps, featuring heavily reinforced frames and exceptionally ruggedized components. This concept, however, quickly met its demise. The projected costs would have been astronomical, the production timeline utterly unacceptable, and even these specially reinforced Jeeps would still inevitably succumb to catastrophic damage in the most severe crash incidents. Other inventive minds suggested employing parachute delivery, deploying Jeeps on colossal cargo chutes from relatively low altitudes. Initial test drops showed considerable promise until the regrettable incidents began: Jeeps splashing into rivers, becoming entangled in dense tree canopies, or landing precariously close to, or even within, enemy positions, rendering their retrieval virtually impossible. Gliders, at the very least, offered the distinct advantage of placing the crucial vehicles precisely where the ground troops required them. By the nascent months of 1943, this technological impasse had escalated into a full-blown crisis. Operation Husky, the monumental invasion of Sicily, was firmly scheduled for July of that year. Airborne divisions were slated to spearhead this critical assault, and their desperate need for robust vehicle support was acutely felt. Commanders found themselves confronting the grim prospect of committing paratroopers to intense combat situations burdened by the same debilitating mobility disadvantage that had exacted such a heavy toll on German forces during the Battle of Crete. The Quartermaster Corps, having exhausted its own reservoir of innovative solutions, found itself at a complete loss. It was at this critical juncture that someone providentially recalled the eccentric civilian engineer from Vermont, known for his seemingly extravagant and unconventional crate design. Palmer Putnam's creation was, in no conventional sense, merely a crate. It was, rather, a meticulously engineered destruction machine, designed with uncanny precision to systematically dismantle itself in a predetermined, exact sequence. When military engineers, acting under considerable pressure and with marked reluctance from airborne commanders, finally scrutinized his intricate blueprints in February 1943, they encountered a design that flagrantly contravened every established principle of cargo packaging they had ever learned. Traditional military containers were meticulously constructed to safeguard their precious contents through sheer structural integrity, relying on unyielding, rigid walls designed to staunchly resist any form of deformation. Putnam's groundbreaking design, in stark contrast, embraced the antithesis of this philosophy. It was ingeniously conceived to collapse, to crumple, and to expertly absorb the brutal energy of impact by systematically disintegrating in a highly controlled and progressive manner. This revolutionary concept drew its inspiration from a fundamental principle that would not become a widely accepted, mainstream automotive safety doctrine for another 2 decades. The brilliant innovation of crumple zones. The fundamental framework of Putnam's design employed plywood panels, precisely 3/4 of an inch thick, meticulously arranged in an intricate honeycomb pattern around the Jeep. However, these were not merely solid, unyielding walls. Putnam had ingeniously engineered them with deliberate points of weakness, precisely scored sections that were designed to buckle and fail under specific, predetermined load thresholds. One might envision it as a sophisticated wooden accordion, expertly crafted to compress in a series of distinct stages. The outermost panels were designed to fail first, meticulously absorbing the initial, raw shock of impact. As these outer panels progressively collapsed inward, they methodically triggered the sequential failure of secondary panels, which, in turn, absorbed the subsequent wave of kinetic energy. By the time the destructive forces finally reached the Jeep itself, they had been systematically dissipated through multiple, carefully orchestrated layers of progressive destruction. In essence, the crate was meticulously designed to sacrifice itself, ensuring the survival and functionality of the invaluable vehicle it contained. A complex network of robust steel cables traversed the entire structure in an intricate web-like pattern, meticulously connecting the floor panels to the roof panels. These specialized cables were endowed with a precise, predetermined tension rating. During routine handling and transportation, they remained sufficiently loose, allowing for a slight degree of structural flex. However, in the event of a catastrophic crash, these cables would instantly become taut, functioning as crucial energy limiters, expertly preventing the crate from collapsing too rapidly. If the structure were to fail with excessive speed, the entirety of the impact energy would instantaneously strike the Jeep, yielding a result indistinguishable from a conventional, unprotected crash. Conversely, if the structure were to fail too slowly, the crate would not sufficiently compress before the glider collided with secondary obstacles. Putnam had painstakingly calculated the exact gauge and tension required for these cables to effectively distribute the immense deceleration forces over an approximate duration of 0.2 of a second. This minute fraction of time proved to be the pivotal factor, making the profound difference between a merely bent axle and a fully functional, operational vehicle. The sophisticated engineering extended to the floor assembly, which was equally ingenious. Rather than being mounted directly and rigidly to the glider deck, the entire crated package rested upon an intricate system of wooden skids. These skids were interconnected by specialized shear pins, meticulously designed to snap at precisely predetermined force levels. This clever mechanism allowed the entire package to slide forward by several feet during the impact, even as the glider itself came to an abrupt halt around it. This crucial sliding motion served to further extend the vital deceleration time. One might liken it to the arresting cable system found on an aircraft carrier, with the key distinction that instead of gradually bringing a high-speed aircraft to a halt, Putnam's system was expertly designed to gradually decelerate a Jeep, while everything else in its immediate vicinity experienced an instantaneous cessation of motion. Within the confines of the crate, the Jeep itself was not secured in the conventional, rigid fashion. Instead, Putnam had devised its own intricate suspension system, strategically placed rubber blocks positioned at specific points on the vehicle's frame. These blocks were held firmly in place by wooden brackets, which were themselves designed to break away under extreme load conditions. The Jeep, in essence, floated within the crate, meticulously cushioned on all sides. During a crash, as the outer crate progressively collapsed inward, the rubber blocks simultaneously compressed, adding yet another crucial layer of energy absorption. The true brilliance of the design resided in its precise sequencing. The outer panels failed, the steel cables stretched, the floor skid slid forward, the inner brackets broke away, and finally, the rubber compressed. This intricate cascade of events masterfully transformed a single, massive impact into a series of smaller, progressively absorbed, and ultimately survivable impacts. The Quartermaster Corps engineers, who meticulously reviewed this extraordinary design, readily acknowledged its profound theoretical elegance. However, they were equally cognizant of its daunting practical complexities and the logistical nightmare it presented. Each individual crate demanded an astonishing 220 board feet of aircraft-grade plywood, a material so stringently rationed that many civilian furniture manufacturers had been compelled to cease operations entirely to preserve the precious supply for the war effort. The inclusion of the specialized steel cable added another significant 40 pounds to the weight of each crate. Furthermore, the demand for rubber blocks directly competed with the critical production of tires. The assembly process itself mandated the expertise of highly trained carpenters, who had to adhere to incredibly precise specifications, leaving absolutely no margin for error in either panel thickness or cable tension. And then, there was the aspect that profoundly exasperated the military logistics officers. The crate was unequivocally a single-use item. After a solitary landing, it was reduced to mere scrap wood. There was no possibility of salvaging it, nor could it be repurposed. Every Jeep successfully delivered necessitated the destruction of another crate. When Putnam meticulously presented his cost analysis, the figures were undeniably damning. Each crate was projected to cost approximately $180 to construct, a substantial sum considering the Jeep itself cost $738. This meant an additional 24% was being added to the vehicle's price purely for its specialized packaging. Multiplying this figure by the 10,000 Jeeps the Army planned to deliver by glider over the ensuing year revealed a staggering $1.8 million solely for packaging, an amount roughly equivalent to $31 million in today's currency, all for wooden boxes destined to be abandoned in French fields. The Quartermaster General famously dubbed it the most exorbitantly priced kindling in the annals of military history. Nevertheless, airborne commanders, faced with grim casualty projections for operations lacking essential vehicle support, unequivocally articulated their position: either allocate the necessary funds or face the cancellation of critical airborne missions. The weighty decision ascended to the War Department, and in March 1943, defying every ingrained bureaucratic instinct to refuse, they ultimately authorized comprehensive field testing. Wright Field, Ohio. April 1943. The rigorous testing program commenced not with actual gliders, but with comparatively simple drop tests conducted from tall wooden towers. Engineers were understandably unwilling to risk valuable, expensive gliders and highly trained pilots on an entirely unproven concept. They meticulously constructed a 15-foot platform, carefully loaded a crated Jeep onto a specialized release mechanism, and then allowed the unyielding force of gravity to perform its work. The initial drop utilized a prototype crate, with Putnam himself personally overseeing the meticulous assembly. He had journeyed from Vermont at his own considerable expense, driven by an unwavering determination to definitively prove the skeptics wrong. The crated Jeep impacted the ground with a resounding thud. The crate itself exploded into a myriad of splinters, precisely as its innovative design intended. And when the debris was finally cleared, the vehicle, astonishingly, sprang to life on the very first crank. Engineers meticulously inspected the frame with precision levels and measuring tools. There was no discernible distortion, and the suspension remained entirely intact. One officer present later recorded in his official report that he had fully anticipated a catastrophic disaster, yet instead bore witness to something that utterly defied conventional common sense. Emboldened by this success, they progressively increased the drop height to 20 feet, then to 25 feet. Each subsequent test involved new crates and fresh jeeps. The remarkable results remained consistently positive. However, the quartermaster observers, ever thorough, were not fully satisfied with mere tower drops. Real-world glider impacts invariably involve significant horizontal velocity, not solely vertical force. Such impacts entail complex dynamics of sliding, tumbling, and highly asymmetric loads. While the tower tests unequivocally demonstrated the crate's ability to withstand straight-down impacts, combat scenarios would rarely, if ever, be so straightforward. Consequently, in May, the testing moved into its next, more perilous phase: actual glider crashes. This stage proved to be both exceptionally expensive and inherently dangerous. The test protocol devised was undeniably brutal. A crated jeep would be loaded into a CG-4A glider, which would then be towed to an altitude of 800 feet. Upon reaching the designated landing zone, the glider would be released, and the pilot would be instructed to bring it down with deliberate force, intentionally hard. These were not the gentle, controlled approaches pilots would typically attempt under ideal conditions. These were meticulously orchestrated worst-case scenarios. Pilots received explicit instructions to simulate actual combat landings, steep approaches, high-speed touchdowns, and landings on unforgiving, rough terrain. Wright Field had meticulously prepared several diverse landing zones, each presenting varying conditions: freshly plowed earth, densely packed clay, and one zone deliberately strewn with logs to realistically simulate the challenging terrain of a hedgerow. Over a grueling period of 6 weeks, a total of 23 glider crash tests were conducted with crated jeeps. The initial 5 tests proceeded flawlessly. Gliders disintegrated as expected, crates shattered into their engineered components, and the jeeps, remarkably, drove away under their own power. The 6th test, however, introduced unforeseen complications. The pilot misjudged his approach, came in at an excessively high speed, and the glider cartwheeled violently after its initial impact. The crate and the jeep tumbled twice, end over end, a truly catastrophic event. Observers fully anticipated total destruction. Yet, when the swirling dust finally settled, they discovered the jeep lying on its side, still securely strapped within the mangled remains of the crate. They quickly righted the vehicle, meticulously checked for any damage, and found only a bent front bumper and a single cracked headlight lens. The engine, against all odds, started. It drove. Even a complete glider tumble, a scenario of extreme violence, had not exceeded the extraordinary protective capacity of Putnam's innovative crate. The protective capabilities of the crate. The most extraordinary confirmation materialized during test number 12. As the glider approached its landing zone, a sudden, powerful crosswind buffeted its right wing, causing it to dip sharply and violently strike the ground. The fuselage, unable to withstand the immense impact, spun a full 180 degrees before fracturing cleanly amidships, while the tail section completely detached. The forward portion of the glider, still containing its precious cargo, the jeep, continued to hurtle another 50 feet, shedding its fabric skin and wooden structural ribs in a dramatic display of disintegration. The scene was akin to a violent explosion, with debris scattered extensively across an impressive 100-yard radius. Recovery crews faced a daunting task, requiring a full 20 minutes simply to pinpoint the location of the jeep amidst the extensive wreckage. Astonishingly, they discovered it largely intact, nestled within the shattered remnants of its protective crate, though thoroughly covered in splintered wood and shredded fabric. A mere 15 minutes later, the resilient vehicle was operational. the test pilot, who had miraculously emerged from the catastrophic crash with only minor contusions, stood beside the running jeep, his face a mask of disbelieving laughter. However, not every trial achieved flawless success. Test 17, for instance, exposed a critical design flaw in the floor skid mechanism. The glider encountered an unexpected depression in the landing field, causing the skids to jam rather than glide smoothly, and the abrupt halt resulted in the unfortunate bending of the Jeep's rear axle. Palmer Putnam dedicated 3 intensive days to meticulously redesigning the skid attachment points, incorporating strategically beveled edges intended to preclude any future jamming, even when encountering uneven terrain. The refined design was subsequently incorporated into Test 20, and the previously identified issue was completely resolved. By the close of June, the comprehensive testing program had achieved an impressive 87% survival rate, signifying that an overwhelming 87% of crated Jeeps emerged from simulated crashes in fully drivable condition. This represented a dramatic improvement over the previous 30% survival rate associated with standard packaging methods. The Quartermaster Corps could no longer credibly dispute the compelling results. Putnam's innovative crate design was undeniably effective, yet the acceptance of his design did not equate to the acceptance of Putnam himself. In the official reports submitted to the War Department, the groundbreaking innovation was attributed to the collective efforts of Quartermaster Corps engineers in collaboration with unnamed civilian consultants. Putnam's name was relegated to footnotes, conspicuously absent from any prominent headlines. The pervasive issue of institutional pride had not dissipated. Senior officers, while acknowledging that this ingenious design would undoubtedly save countless lives and contribute significantly to winning battles, were unequivocally unwilling to bestow credit upon an outsider who had so definitively proven their own engineers' shortcomings. Consequently, production contracts were swiftly dispatched to lumber mills situated in Oregon and Michigan. By July 1943, manufacturing facilities were busily churning out these specialized crates at an astonishing rate of 200 units per week. Detailed training manuals meticulously instructed assembly crews on the precise specifications required for construction. And Palmer Putnam, his significant contribution officially classified, his pivotal role intentionally minimized, and his revolutionary design poised to face its ultimate trial in the crucible of actual combat, quietly returned to Vermont. Operation Overlord, the monumental invasion of Normandy, remains etched in history as the largest amphibious assault ever undertaken. Yet, the beaches represented merely the initial phase of the complex operation. Allied strategists were acutely aware that German armored divisions would rapidly converge to contain the nascent beachhead, and if they succeeded in trapping the invasion forces within a constricted coastal strip, the entire operation risked collapsing into an unimaginable bloodbath. Rapid advancement inland was, therefore, an absolute imperative. Within mere hours of the initial landings, Allied troops were tasked with pushing beyond the immediate beach defenses, swiftly seizing crucial crossroads, effectively severing German reinforcement routes, and establishing robust defensive perimeters deep within occupied territory. Paratroopers were designated to spearhead this critical inland thrust, executing their jumps behind enemy lines in the pre-dawn hours. However, the bitter lessons learned from previous airborne operations in Sicily, Salerno, and Italy were unequivocally clear. Paratroopers operating without adequate vehicle support were dangerously exposed and immobile targets. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions urgently requested a staggering 1,400 jeeps for the D-Day operations, an unprecedented quantity for airborne delivery. Each of these versatile jeeps was intended to transport a machine gun crew, a mortar team, or serve as a vital ammunition resupply vehicle. The divisions also requested 75mm pack howitzers, formidable anti-tank guns, and essential medical supplies, all of which were entirely dependent on having vehicles available for their movement. Without the critical support of these jeeps, the paratroopers would be compelled to consolidate around their respective drop zones, patiently awaiting the arrival of ground forces, a delay that could potentially span several days. With the jeeps, however, they possessed the capability to aggressively strike German positions, establish crucial roadblocks many miles inland, and sow widespread chaos within the German rear areas. The entire operational concept, a daring gamble by Allied planners, hinged entirely on the efficacy of Palmer Putnam's crates under the brutal realities of combat conditions, at an immense scale, and directly under enemy fire. Loading operations commenced with meticulous precision on June 5 at various airfields scattered across southern England. Each crate had been pre-assembled at forward staging areas, with jeeps carefully driven inside and secured according to Putnam's exacting specifications. Ground crews then expertly utilized winches and specialized loading ramps to painstakingly maneuver the crated jeeps into the waiting CG-4A gliders. This intricate process consumed approximately 45 minutes per glider. With hundreds of gliders being loaded simultaneously, the entire operation bore a striking resemblance to a highly efficient factory floor. The crews executed their tasks with rehearsed precision, diligently checking cable tensions, verifying the correct installation of shear pins, and confirming that the crucial rubber mounting blocks had not deteriorated during storage. A single error in assembly carried the grave potential for a destroyed jeep and, consequently, stranded troops. The vanguard of gliders detached from their tow planes over Normandy at precisely 0330 hours on June 6, a full 3 hours before the momentous beach landings. They descended in successive waves, typically 20 or 30 aircraft at a time, released from their parent tow planes at altitudes ranging between 600 and 1,000 feet. What the rigorous training exercises at Wright Field could never adequately replicate was the sheer, unadulterated chaos of combat landings. Intense anti-aircraft fire ripped through the glider formations, with tracers vividly illuminating the pre-dawn darkness. Some pilots, facing imminent danger, executed aggressive evasive maneuvers, throwing their gliders into steep dives and sharp turns that subjected their precious cargo to forces far exceeding design specifications. Others discovered their designated landing zones obscured by dense smoke or already pockmarked with craters from relentless naval bombardment. They were forced to land wherever they could find an opening, in fields deliberately flooded by German defensive measures, in pastures crisscrossed with menacing anti-glider poles ominously dubbed Rommel's asparagus, or even in the humble gardens behind quaint Norman farmhouses. Glider 17, belonging to the 325th Glider Infantry Regiment, collided with a formidable stone wall at full speed. The nose section crumpled catastrophically, and the cockpit instantly collapsed, tragically killing both pilots. The fuselage accordion folded backward, and the tail section violently tore away completely. When troops finally reached the mangled wreck 20 minutes later to attempt the recovery of the jeep, they fully anticipated finding nothing but scrap metal. The crate, however, had disintegrated precisely as designed, its wooden panels scattered across 50 feet of the field. The jeep sat amidst the debris field, its wheels mired in mud, yet remarkably, it was structurally sound. They promptly started its engine, backed it out of the wreckage, mounted a .30 caliber machine gun, and had it actively engaged in combat within the hour. Glider 31 from the 101st Airborne Division made an emergency landing in a heavily flooded zone near St. Miraglise. the pilot had no alternative. Every other potential landing spot was demonstrably worse. The glider skipped across the standing water like a stone, tragically struck a submerged fence post, and ultimately nosedived into the mud. Water rapidly inundated the cargo bay. Recovery crews waded through waist-deep water, fully expecting to discover a hopelessly drowned engine. Putnam's ingenious crate design had not specifically anticipated water landings, but the elevated floor skids had inadvertently kept the Jeep sufficiently high that its engine intake remained dry. They successfully towed it to dry ground with another Jeep, meticulously drained the carburetor, and to their immense relief, it roared to life. It must be acknowledged that not every delivery achieved success. Some gliders crashed so catastrophically that even Putnam's brilliant engineering could not preserve the cargo. Gliders that tragically struck trees and disintegrated in midair before ever reaching the ground. Gliders that landed in treacherous German minefields and detonated ordnance against which the crate offered no protection. And gliders that erupted in flames after being struck by incendiary rounds during their approach. However, these catastrophic failures represented a remarkably small fraction, less than 15% of all deliveries. The remaining 85% successfully placed fully functional vehicles directly into the hands of airborne troops within mere hours of landing. By 0900 hours on June 6, an astonishing total of over 2,100 Jeeps were fully operational behind German lines. They efficiently towed anti-tank guns into strategic positions to effectively ambush advancing German armor. They swiftly transported the wounded to critical aid stations. They tirelessly supplied vital ammunition to isolated units. In essence, they transformed scattered paratroopers into a cohesive, mobile striking force. German commanders, in their after-action reports, candidly recorded their profound confusion. They had anticipated encountering only lightly armed infantry that could be easily contained and ultimately destroyed. Instead, they were confronted with highly mechanized units possessing significant firepower and impressive mobility, units that appeared impossibly deep behind their lines, with impossibly swift deployment. The standard German response to airborne landings, to immediately dispatch armor to crush the drop zones, was repeatedly thwarted by Jeep-mounted ambushes many miles from their expected positions. The rapid operational tempo that Allied planners had daringly gambled on, which was entirely contingent upon the successful airborne delivery of vehicles, had indeed materialized. And Palmer Putnam, back in his quiet Vermont home, would not learn of his design's resounding success until he read about it in the newspapers weeks later. The devastating war in Europe concluded in May 1945, followed by the cessation of hostilities in the Pacific that August. As the vast military apparatus began to demobilize, millions of pages of meticulously classified documents were transferred into archival storage, a significant portion of which bore the stamps, restricted, or confidential. Among these invaluable documents were the comprehensive Wright Field Test reports, the detailed D-Day after-action assessments, and extensive correspondence meticulously detailing Palmer Putnam's crucial contributions to airborne logistics. The official history of the airborne operations, meticulously published by the War Department in 1947, dedicated a mere 3 pages to the subject of glider-delivered vehicles. It briefly mentioned innovative packaging solutions developed by Quartermaster Corps engineers, and included a concise technical description of shock-absorbing crates. Palmer Putnam's name, however, appeared nowhere within the entirety of the document. Palmer Putnam's designation, his very identity, was conspicuously absent from the official document. For the prevailing purposes of institutional recognition and historical attribution, the groundbreaking innovation was exclusively credited to the military establishment. This practice was, regrettably, far from an anomaly within the annals of post-war military historiography. The armed forces had meticulously cultivated a venerable tradition of downplaying or entirely overlooking civilian contributions, thereby meticulously preserving an enduring facade of martial self-sufficiency. It was the combat engineers, according to the official narrative, who masterfully erected the vital bridges. Military scientists, it was asserted, single-handedly pioneered the development of radar systems. And the Army's own brilliant cryptographers, the public was told, were solely responsible for deciphering enemy codes. This was the neatly constructed narrative that permeated public consciousness, and, it must be conceded, in numerous instances, this portrayal held a degree of veracity. Yet, the deliberate obliteration of Putnam's pivotal involvement transcended the routine bureaucratic practice of credit monopolization. A profound sense of institutional shame and discomfort was inextricably interwoven with this act of suppression. The Quartermaster Corps, in its initial assessment, had unceremoniously rejected his ingenious design, branding it as extravagant and summarily dismissing him as an eccentric, impractical civilian. When the dire exigencies of war eventually compelled them to reluctantly put his concept to the test, and it demonstrated unequivocally brilliant efficacy, the institutional reaction was conspicuously devoid of gratitude. Instead, it was characterized by a simmering, quiet resentment and a meticulously orchestrated campaign to systematically reframe the entire historical account. Putnam himself, a man of singular focus, evinced no inclination to contend for public acclaim. Following the cessation of hostilities, he quietly redirected his considerable talents back to his pioneering wind energy endeavors, immersed himself in the complexities of hydroelectric systems, and published a series of scholarly papers on renewable energy that were startlingly prescient, often decades ahead of their contemporary understanding. Throughout the 1950s, he authored an influential treatise on wind power generation, which subsequently attained the status of a foundational text within the burgeoning field. When occasionally prompted by inquisitive colleagues about his wartime contributions, he would vaguely allude to having provided consultancy services for the military, but steadfastly refrained from divulging any specific details. Whether he had been bound by stringent non-disclosure agreements or simply exercised a profound personal discretion remains an ambiguity within the extant historical records. Nevertheless, the visionary individual who had masterfully resolved one of the war's most pressing logistical dilemmas quietly receded into relative obscurity, while his remarkably effective solution seamlessly assimilated into standard military practice. Conversely, the ingenious crate design itself did not suffer a similar fate of disappearance. Military logistics planners, despite their reluctance to acknowledge its true originator, swiftly recognized its intrinsic value and profound utility. Throughout the immediate post-war period of the late 1940s and extending through the Korean War, various iterations of Putnam's groundbreaking shock-absorbing container began to feature prominently in official supply manuals. The distinctive honeycomb panel structure, the innovative principle of progressive collapse, and the meticulously engineered cable-limited energy dissipation mechanisms all rapidly became quintessential features in the specialized domain of airborne cargo packaging. By the advent of the 1960s, the original design had undergone such profound evolutionary changes that it had become almost unrecognizable to the casual observer. Advanced modern materials had systematically supplanted the original plywood and steel cable components. Engineers had incorporated sophisticated crushable aluminum sections, highly efficient foam energy absorbers, and responsive pneumatic cushions, yet the fundamental conceptual underpinning remained steadfastly intact, to meticulously safeguard precious cargo through the deliberate, controlled destruction of the container itself in a predetermined sequence. The subsequent advent of the Freedom of Information Act and the sweeping declassification initiatives of the 1970s dramatically altered the landscape. Diligent researchers, meticulously sifting through newly unsealed World War II documents housed at the National Archives, fortuitously stumbled upon the crucial Wright field test reports. It was within the unassuming footnotes and appendices of these technical records that Palmer Putnam's name finally began to surface from decades of anonymity. A particularly tenacious graduate student, engaged in the intricate task of composing a dissertation on wartime logistics innovations, painstakingly tracked down the original, dismissive rejection letters from the Quartermaster Corps, unearthed Putnam's initial, visionary proposals, and meticulously reconstructed the precise chronological sequence of events. In the year 1978, a modest but significant academic article made its appearance in a respected military history journal, a full 35 years after the actual events, at long last definitively linking Putnam to the revolutionary airborne Jeep delivery system. By this belated juncture, Putnam himself had passed away 2 years prior, tragically unaware that historians had finally unearthed his long-buried, monumental contribution. This belated exposure instigated a subtle, yet notable, reassessment within specialized military engineering circles. Subsequent articles published in various Army logistics publications cautiously acknowledged that the prevailing standard narrative had indeed been incomplete, fundamentally lacking in a full appreciation of the facts. It was now conceded that civilian innovation had, in reality, played a far more substantial and influential role than had been previously acknowledged or formally stated. However, this critical correction reached only highly circumscribed audiences, dedicated specialists, meticulous historians, and engineers assiduously studying legacy systems. The broader public, regrettably, never became privy to this compelling story. World War II documentaries, in their popular appeal, continued to exclusively focus on the grand narratives of battles and the commanding figures of generals, leaving no narrative space for the quiet genius of a packaging engineer. The prevailing, often romanticized, heroism narrative simply did not accommodate the understated contribution of a wind energy consultant from Vermont who designed remarkably effective wooden boxes. What demonstrably endured and propagated with remarkable resilience was the technology itself, a testament to its intrinsic brilliance. Modern airdrop containers, currently employed by the United States military, unequivocally trace their direct lineage to Putnam's foundational principles. The sophisticated container delivery system, first introduced in the 1980s, ingeniously utilizes layered energy absorption techniques to meticulously protect its precious cargo during challenging low-altitude parachute drops. Similarly, the Army's Advanced Low-Velocity Airdrop System, meticulously developed in the 1990s, skillfully employs the principle of controlled structural collapse to effectively cushion heavy equipment during impact. Even a myriad of civilian applications have judiciously borrowed and adapted this profound concept. The ubiquitous automotive crumple zones, the meticulously engineered packaging for fragile electronic devices, and the rigorously crash-tested shipping containers that safeguard valuable goods in transit. The profound idea that Palmer Putnam had so valiantly championed in the face of entrenched institutional resistance, the revolutionary notion that true protection emanates from strategic, controlled destruction rather than from brute, unyielding strength, eventually ascended to become a foundational tenet across a multitude of diverse industries. In the year 2003, a modest historical marker was discreetly erected at a Vermont wind farm, the very location where Putnam had conducted his groundbreaking turbine experiments during the 1930s. The commemorative plaque duly acknowledged his pioneering work in renewable energy and included a solitary, laconic sentence pertaining to his World War II contributions. Developed innovative cargo packaging systems for military airborne operations. There were no further details, no comprehensive explanation of the profound significance of this achievement, or why it held such critical importance, merely a fleeting footnote, which, with poignant irony, precisely mirrored the diminished status to which institutional memory had ultimately relegated him. The countless thousands of soldiers who, by fortune, drove their jeeps out of glider wrecks never comprehended the identity of the individual who had, through his ingenuity, made their survival possible. Even the legions of engineers, who have meticulously built upon his foundational principles, for 8 decades rarely possess knowledge of the true origin story. And therein lies the ultimate, most profound irony. The most profoundly successful military innovations are frequently those that seamlessly integrate into the background, becoming so inherently standard and ubiquitous that their origins are never questioned, their creators rarely remembered. Let us fast forward to Bagram Airfield, Afghanistan, in the year 2010. A colossal C-17 Globemaster cargo aircraft gracefully ascends into the twilight sky. Its cavernous cargo bay is meticulously loaded with what the Air Force formally designates as a Type 5 airdrop platform, a robust wooden pallet securely holding a Humvee, meticulously enveloped in layers of protective packaging. The immense aircraft climbs to a precise altitude of 200 feet, meticulously levels off, and the skilled loadmaster initiates the complex release sequence. Parachutes majestically deploy. The heavy platform smoothly exits the cargo bay, and a mere 30 seconds later, it impacts a desolate desert landing zone at a controlled velocity of 24 feet per second. The platform strikes the ground with a resounding thud, the protective packaging crushes in a predetermined, staged sequence, and the vital vehicle ensconced within expertly absorbs forces that would otherwise warp an unprotected frame into irreparable scrap metal. Soldiers arrive at the designated drop zone approximately 15 minutes later, efficiently cut away the now destroyed packaging, and promptly drive the operational Humvee to a forward operating base. Palmer Putnam had tragically passed away 34 years before this particular airdrop transpired, yet his indelible engineering DNA is intricately woven into every single layer of that sophisticated protective system. The contemporary container delivery system represents the remarkable evolution of Putnam's original wooden crates, meticulously refined over 7 decades of relentless advancements in material science. Instead of the original plywood panels, current systems ingeniously employ aerospace-grade honeycomb aluminum, meticulously engineered to collapse at precisely predetermined crush loads. In lieu of rudimentary steel cables, they now utilize advanced aramid fiber webbing, designed with precisely calculated tensile limits. And instead of simple rubber blocks, they incorporate highly specialized closed-cell foam, accurately rated for specific energy absorption per cubic inch. However, if one were to meticulously strip away these advanced modern materials, one would invariably discover the identical underlying architectural principles, outer layers meticulously designed to fail first, progressive energy dissipation achieved through meticulously controlled destruction, sophisticated suspension systems engineered to effectively decouple the precious cargo from violent impact forces, and robust floor assemblies specifically designed to slide and absorb energy rather than simply transfer destructive shock waves. The Joint Precision Airdrop System, JPADS, a revolutionary innovation introduced in 2004, further enhanced cargo parachutes with advanced GPS guidance, enabling pinpoint delivery of critical supplies to troops in remote locations that were inaccessible by conventional ground convoys. This remarkable system possesses the capability to deliver 5 tons of essential supplies within a mere 150 feet of a designated target from an astonishing altitude of 25,000 feet. Yet, such unparalleled accuracy would be rendered utterly meaningless if the valuable cargo arrived in a state of destruction. Consequently, every single JPAD's container utilizes direct descendants of Putnam's original collapse-in-sequence design. During extensive operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, the system successfully delivered over 5 million pounds of vital cargo, with an impressive 98% serviceability rate, meaning a staggering 98% of dropped items arrived intact and fully usable. This extraordinary achievement stands as the clearest, most unequivocal validation of Putnam's profound core insight, that if one engineers the destruction with sufficient precision and foresight, nothing truly critical will ultimately be destroyed. Civilian applications have not merely adopted this principle, but have enthusiastically propelled it to even greater heights of innovation. Modern automotive design, for instance, now mandates the integration of sophisticated crumple zones that are meticulously engineered to absorb collision energy, all while scrupulously maintaining the rigid integrity of the passenger compartment, a design philosophy that precisely mirrors Putnam's original approach to safeguarding Jeeps within collapsing crates. The ubiquitous iPhone residing in your pocket is encased in packaging designed with strikingly similar staged collapse structures, precisely engineered foam inserts that compress in a sequential manner to meticulously protect the delicate glass and intricate electronics during the inevitable impacts of shipping. Even Amazon's widely lauded frustration-free packaging initiative leverages the very same sophisticated energy dissipation mathematics. The pervasive ubiquity of this fundamental concept has, ironically, rendered it largely invisible to the casual observer. Most individuals do not consciously ponder the intricate reasons why fragile items miraculously survive the rigors of shipping, nor do they question the brilliant engineering ingenuity that makes such resilience possible. Disaster relief operations, with their inherent urgency and extreme challenges, serve as a compelling showcase for the technology's contemporary reach and indispensable utility. When devastating earthquakes or catastrophic hurricanes sever all conventional ground access, airdrop supplies frequently become the sole viable option for delivering life-sustaining aid. The United Nations and various national militaries meticulously maintain extensive stockpiles of specialized airdrop-ready containers, all expertly designed to withstand the harsh realities of rough landings in unprepared and often unforgiving zones. Essential medical equipment, advanced water purification systems, and robust emergency shelters, all these critical supplies are meticulously packaged in direct descendants of Putnam's ingenious World War II crates. Following the catastrophic 2010 Haiti earthquake, U.S. Air Force C-17s conducted over 200 vital airdrops into the devastated city of Port-au-Prince, utilizing advanced GPS-guided containers. The sophisticated packaging that so effectively protected those crucial supplies, the very systems that enabled clean water and life-saving antibiotics to reach desperate survivors, meticulously adhered to fundamental design principles first conceived and meticulously drafted on a visionary Vermont engineer's drawing board back in 1942. The innovative design for a specialized cargo crate, a solution that would prove indispensable for wartime logistics, first materialized on a civilian engineer's drawing board in 1942, marking a pivotal moment in the history of military transport. The profound irony lies in the fact that Palmer C. Putnam himself never propelled this particular innovation beyond its immediate, pressing application during the conflict. He approached the challenge with a direct, problem-solving mindset, devising an ingenious solution, and then promptly redirected his intellectual energies towards subsequent endeavors. His extensive post-war research was predominantly dedicated to the burgeoning field of wind energy, where he meticulously theorized and predicted how advanced turbine technology could, in due course, generate substantial amounts of electricity from sustainable, renewable sources. This groundbreaking work, much like his earlier cargo crate design, was remarkably prescient, yet it remained largely overlooked and undervalued throughout his own lifetime. Nevertheless, the tides of time have turned. Today, vast wind farms contribute over 10% of the U.S.'s total electricity supply, and Putnam's pioneering research papers are now frequently referenced within fundamental turbine engineering texts. He was, in essence, an individual consistently operating approximately 30 years ahead of contemporary thought, perpetually dismissed by his peers, only to be posthumously vindicated long after any personal recognition would have held significance. In a characteristically formalized, bureaucratic manner, the military eventually bestowed a measure of acknowledgment upon him. It was not until 1991 that the Army Quartermaster Museum, situated at Fort Lee, Virginia, unveiled a modest exhibit dedicated to advancements in airborne logistics. Within this display, a meticulously crafted scale model of a CG-4A glider is showcased, featuring a transparent cutaway view that reveals a crated jeep nestled securely inside. The accompanying placard unequivocally credits Palmer C. Putnam, identified as a civilian engineer, with the conceptualization and development of this crucial design. This constitutes a rather subtle gesture, akin to an institutional footnote that quietly rectifies the historical narrative without broadly publicizing the correction. Visitors who take the time to peruse this plaque gain an insight that eludes most of the populace, that one of World War II's most critical logistical breakthroughs originated not from the strategic minds of military personnel or the vast resources of defense contractors, but rather from a visionary wind energy consultant. This individual possessed a unique understanding that, at times, to safeguard something truly valuable, one must permit its surrounding protective elements to yield and break in precisely the correct, controlled manner. That very principle, initially scorned as extravagant and impractical in 1942, has now become so intrinsically fundamental to contemporary engineering practices that its once controversial nature has been entirely forgotten. Perhaps this imperceptible ubiquity represents his ultimate legacy, not personal renown or explicit credit, but an idea so profoundly successful that it seamlessly integrates into the fabric of our world, effectively becoming invisible.